Have you ever wondered who some of the most popular musicians of the past were? Glenn Miller was one of the most popular musicians of the 1930s and 40s, but he has since been forgotten by most people. Musical history is important, as most modern music would be very different without the influence of what came before, and jazz especially has had a very heavy influence on American music. First, let's discuss who Glenn Miller was and what he did, then why he was so popular and what made his music interesting, and finally, why he was forgotten. First and foremost, let's discuss who Glenn Miller was. Glenn Miller initially performed as a trombonist for other jazz groups, working with some major names in the industry, such as Benny Goodman and Bing Crosby. In 1937, Miller formed his first band, which would go relatively unnoticed for a long time, until 1938, when his music became a big hit. Many of his songs would hit the top charts of 1939 all the way through 1942. In 1942, Glenn Miller enlisted in the US Army and led another band to drive up morale throughout Europe. However, in 1944, while on a flight from England to France, Miller disappeared. The accepted reasoning behind this is that his plane crashed, although some conspiracies suggest that he was sent on a diplomatic mission to Nazi Germany and was killed on his way there, or that he was killed by a friendly fire. Now that we've seen what his life was like, let's discuss why he was popular. Miller's musical style is often very melancholy, although some pieces are very upbeat, especially those composed during his time in the army. This song in particular, Moonlight Serenade, was one of his most popular, and it was played at the beginning and end of all of his performances. Miller's popularity was helped by jazz music just in general being popular, as well as the service in the army. This led many more people, both American and European, to hear his music, even those who normally wouldn't have been able to hear him perform. In addition, to this day, the Glenn Miller Orchestra continues to perform around the world. Now that we've seen why his music was so popular, let's look at why his music is now somewhat forgotten. Jazz music began in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and it was a product of African American culture in the South. It was an evolution of the blues and was often mixed with the styles and themes of this genre. During the 1920s, jazz music became one of the most popular styles in America, and its popularity would remain unbroken until the 1960s. Miller's career was during the 1930s, when jazz was still the most popular style of music in America, which undoubtedly led to his success. However, during the 1960s, rock and roll became the most popular form of music in America. This, obviously, led to jazz becoming less popular with young people, which meant that more and more jazz groups disbanded. As such, people just stopped listening to Miller's music, for the most part, because it wasn't what was cool anymore. That being said, jazz music continues to live on in modern music, much of which takes very heavy inspiration from the style and arrangements of jazz. Rock and roll, especially, was very heavily influenced by some of the later styles of jazz and blues. This has been a speech about Glenn Miller. Glenn Miller was an exceptionally popular jazz artist from the 1930s. His music was popular due to its sound and Glenn Miller's service during World War II, but, as with most jazz music, it has declined in popularity since then. Despite being relatively obscure by modern standards, Glenn Miller was one of the most popular musicians of his time. It is important to remember musical history so that we can understand why modern music is written and performed the way it is.